Hello everyone, and welcome back to Transcendent Philosophy. This is Seth here, and today we're going to be going over existential threats and the need for a one-world government. The idea of a one-world government is notoriously formidable. It's always displayed in cartoon shows as, Pinky and the Brain, the evil villain who's got the sinister plan to manipulate the world and take everything over. When it comes to villains, if you push the archetype to the limit, it's either you take over the world or you destroy the world. There's not much more you can do beyond that in terms of evil deeds. Maybe torture the entire world. That might be an even worse type of a villain. But I think the collective unconscious, human psyche, we're constantly looking for the villain. We're looking for the thing we should be afraid of. Is it a tiger in the brush? Is that what we should be focused on? Or is it a criminal in our neighborhood? Is that what we should be worried about? Or is it, evil in high places? That's what the biblical perspective is starting to look for, villains in places of authority. And my perspective is that Christianity, it evolved in a slave morality setting. The Jews were basically subjects of the Roman tyranny, right? They were the oppressed, and the Romans were the oppressors. And so morality that evolves under the setting of oppression is going to have aspects of slave morality, as Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for promulgating. So just to review, slave morality is, it takes from the perspective of the slave, it vilifies everything that the masters have. So if the masters have riches is, it's greed. And if the master has many women and many wives, then, sexuality and lust. And if the master has robes and rings and staffs of authority, then that's pride, right? Everything good that the master has can be twisted into a vice. And so I see that those masters, they're the evil ones. And us, we're poor and we're celibate because no women want us because we've got nothing. Well, that's actually a virtue. It's a sign of our character, right? We are humble and we are virtuous. So we twist our slave attributes into virtues, and we twist the master's attributes into vices. So tying this back to one world government. Well, at the time that Christianity developed, Christianity was looking at the Romans and saying, oh, wow, there's this Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire is taking over the world, and the Romans are oppressing us. They killed Jesus Christ himself. And so it's very fitting that John the Revelator, in the Bible, he wrote this very phantasmagoric vision of an evil empire that was very oppressive to the Christians. So it makes sense that if you come from this setting, you're going to fantasize about an evil empire who's doing the oppressing, because that is your experience. You as a Christian under the Romans, you are experiencing an evil tyranny. So that is the Christian bias that created this perspective. So the idea of one world government, it's a flexible idea. It's just the idea of an empire that scales up to the entire planet. And one of the things I hope to show today is why our fears of this are irrational and impractical. It's these types of archaic fears are actually blocking our progress. And if we want the future to be a better place, we're going to have to overcome these fears. So I came across a video, a discussion on the Dark Horse podcast between Brett Weinstein and Daniel Schmattenberger. And I thought this was one of the most fabulous, fantastic discussions on existential threats and the need for one world government. I was blown away. And I really think that Daniel cuts straight to the core of why these archaic fears are problematic and why a one world government is actually the solution to a lot of our modern problems. These modern problems which are not properly addressed by our older philosophies of religion, modern philosophy, and even postmodern philosophy. None of these are fully adequate for handling the modern crises that are on the horizon. So we need to upgrade our thinking to manage the problems that we have to tackle. All right, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Let's take AI weapons right now, specifically automated drone weapons. There's an arms race happening on automated drone weapons. And I think every general and military strategist knows that all of our chance of dying from AI weapons goes up. their kids, everybody's, as we progress in that technology. It's a bad technology. It shouldn't exist. We should create an international moratorium that says nobody builds AI drone weapons, that we don't want automated weapons with high intelligence out there. But we can't make that moratorium because if one country doesn't agree, if one non-country, some non-state actor doesn't agree that has the technology, or let's say everybody agrees, how do we know they're not lying and developing it as an underground black project? So either we don't even make the agreement, or we make the agreement knowing we're going to lie, defect in a black project, spy on their black project, and try to lie to their spies who are spying on us. And so it's like, how do you get around that thing where if anyone does the bad thing in the near term, it confers so much game theoretic advantage that anyone who doesn't do it loses in the long term? Why it was that the peaceful cultures all got slaughtered by the warring cultures. And so what ends up making it through is those who end up being effective enough at war. That's an underlying thing we have to shift, because that has as its eventual attractor space, self-destruction in a finite space.
AI weapons, AI drone weapons. He made some powerful statements. He doesn't think that these weapons should exist. But the question is that even a possible goal to move towards, right? It's kind of like the nuclear proliferation problem. Is it possible for us to just abandon our nukes? It's a vulnerability. So when we think about these problems, I think it's useful to back up and remember that we exist within an evolutionary context, and to think about the game theoretic factors involved. The natural Darwinian forces of the universe are slowly guiding us towards destruction. Evolution has shown that the main way to escape fierce competition is to evolve cooperative behaviors. In a one-on-one scenario, the more violently powerful might succeed. But in a one-to-many scenario, the violently powerful could be classified as evil, and then the less powerful can unite to wipe them out. So evolution might guide us to ride the line between competitive and cooperative strategies so that we can get the advantage of accessibility without going too far and pissing off too many people so as to be classified as evil. Human society has evolved ever greater tribes that just keep growing in size and scope. Intertribal psychology can mimic the psychology that exists at the level of competing individuals. Just like competing individuals can unify to fight a tyrannous individual, competing tribes can unite to fight an oppressive tribe. So each nation could be competitive, but yet not so competitive that they become tyrannously abusive, because that oppression would inspire other nations to unite against them under the righteous banner of justice. We can see examples of this, like the Nazis in Germany. The Allies all united to fight this evil because they were too abusive. Yet the power scaling of nations is different from the power scaling of individuals. Or at least currently it is. Our power scaling is now on planetary destruction levels, right? Our nuclear arsenals can destroy the planet. One mistake at the individual level can be fixed by iterations of evolution, but one mistake at our current global level is not acceptable anymore. We must rigorously anticipate disasters before they occur, because we cannot afford to rely on Darwinism to fix our international policies. Long ago, I realized that the path of human social evolution was necessarily going towards an ever-increasing scope of tribal identity. How did individuals outcompete other individuals? Some unite into families, but then perhaps the familyless unite into gangs and challenge the families. But then perhaps the families unify into tribes and outcompete the gangs. Then religion evolves to unite tribes across larger distances, forming a super tribe to outcompete the regular tribes. Then those super tribes unite into states, and states unite into nations. Religions then evolve a parochial organization so that they can create unity that transcends nations. If national structures collapse, it wouldn't be surprising to find humans revert to lower forms of social organization. Religion might become the most powerful unifier at that point. But assuming we don't annihilate the planet, eventually those humans will reorganize into nations. Yet nations are not a satisfying endpoint for our social evolution. For as long as there are competing nations, there are also competing interests. And as long as there are competing interests, the finite aspects of the planet might become areas of contention. Our evolutionary history is full of bloody, selfish war for resources. It seems obvious that, absent a reliable path to ever-increasing access to resources, scarcity will eventually trigger the violent psychology of our biological inheritance. Yet evolution has also taught us the secret to overcoming this violent instinct. If we believe that other people are not within our tribe, we have less resistance to developing a violent psychology against them. But if we believe that they are within our tribe, their interests become our interests, and it becomes less about competition and more about cooperation. The value of a nation was to unite all its people in cooperation. Yet, assuming a nation was successful in this goal, it must still compete with other nations. A review of the last 70 years of peace, there's a few things that I think have helped us maintain that peace. The threat of mutually assured destruction. Power bipolarity that evolved into a unipolarity. Massive increase in technology that increased access to resources globally. Increase in communication. Increase in moral philosophy. So what do I mean by that? Mutually assured destruction. If we go to war, there are nukes available. And nukes, if used, will destroy everything. And so each nation has to do a cost-benefit analysis. And if war results in everything being destroyed, that's extremely costly. And so nobody wants to go to war if nukes are on the table. And so that's why within the last 70 years, we haven't had major war between nuclear-powered nations. Our warfare has mostly been geopolitical chess games. But we've never allowed it to escalate to nuclear war because that's just too costly. As to the bipolarity, during the Cold War, there was two major world powers, the United States and Russia. And that bipolarity was reduced, simplified into a unipolarity with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The world eventually became united under one superpower, which was the United States. And so that reduced conflict in that there was no major powers to really resist the United States, for better or for worse. And with regards to technology, our farming technology has just continued to advance with robotics and automation in software. So we've had exponential growth in efficiency due to technology, and our birth rates have been able to somewhat stagnate due to reproductive technology. And so technology has helped our efficiency and reduced our population explosion, which has made our population very sustainable. Increase in communication can be also attributed to technology, with telecommunication, with smartphones, with social media. People all across the world can communicate with each other basically at the speed of light as it bounces through the satellites. And that really helps bridge the empathy gap, as people can empathize with other cultures. You can talk and make friends and pen pals with other people. And it makes the common human struggle, it makes us, it increases that brotherhood and camaraderie, because these people become real to us, because distance is no longer an obstacle. And the increase in moral philosophy is basically attributed to the rise of humanism, as we've been kind of growing in our understanding of what it means to be a human and how all of us are stakeholders in this common effort of human well-being. And for the next part, Daniel very eloquently explains why some of the things that were protecting us during the last 70 plus years, those protections are starting to erode. They're starting to fall apart.
I think something that I find particularly important when thinking about catastrophic risk now relative to previous examples of civilization collapse is that until World War II, we couldn't destroy everything. Like, we just didn't have enough technological power for catastrophe weapons. And so you could fight the biggest, bloodiest war, violate all of the rules of war, and it would still be a local phenomena. And with the invention of the bomb, we had now the new technological power to actually destroy habitability of the planet kind of writ large, or at least enough of it that it was a major catastrophic risk. And on the time scales that you think about as an evolutionary biologist of how long humans have been here and the, proto-humans, since World War II is no time at all to have really adapted to understanding what the significance of that is. And the only reason we made it through was because we created an entire global order to make sure we never used that new piece of tech. And in all of history, we always used the arms that we developed. And so we made this whole Bretton Woods world and mutually assured destruction that said, okay, well, let's have so much economic growth so rapidly that nobody has to fight each other and they can all have more because the pie keeps getting bigger. But that starts running up against planetary boundaries and interconnecting the world so much it gets so fragile that, a virus in Wuhan shuts the whole world down because of supply chain, interconnected supply chain issues. So that thing can't run forever. And the mutually assured destruction was one catastrophe weapon and two superpowers. So mutually assured destruction works, the game theory of it works. Well, as soon as you start to add to that the bioweapons and the chemical weapons, the fact that bioweapons can be made very, very cheaply now with CRISPR gene drives and things like that, drone weapons, we have dozens of catastrophe weapons held by many dozens of actors, including non-state actors. And that just keeps getting easier. Mutually assured destruction can't be put on that situation. It doesn't actually have a stable equilibria. So now we have to say, how do we deal with many, many actors having many types of catastrophe weapons that can't have a forced game theoretic solution with a history where we always used our power destructively at a certain point?
So as Daniel alludes, when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, the whole game theoretic mutually assured destruction, it's not good enough anymore. We can't rely on that for protecting the planet because it's not a bipolar situation. It's not US versus Russia. It's because technology is improving, weapons of mass destruction are getting easier and easier to produce by smaller organizations. So if it's just US and Russia, then we can protect each other with mutually assured destruction. But what about a terrorist group? If a terrorist group is able to get nukes, or if a terrorist group is able to obtain a biological weapon that can produce a very lethal pandemic, well, that smaller unit, that smaller group, that smaller organization, they don't really care about mutually assured destruction. You can't guarantee that strategy is going to work for smaller and smaller units. And so as the ease of producing weapons of mass destruction goes up and the availability for smaller and smaller organizations goes up, that's an unsustainable growth pattern because eventually someone crazy enough to use them is going to obtain them. So it sounds like a dreadful predicament for humanity as a whole. But Daniel proposes the following solution.
And the only answer out of the oppression or chaos is the comprehensive education of everyone in the capacity to understand at least three things. They have to increase their first person, second person, and third person epistemics. Their third person epistemics is the easiest. Philosophy of science, formal logic, their ability to actually make sense of base reality through appropriate methodology and find appropriate confidence margin. Second person is my ability to make sense of your perspective. Can I steelman where you're coming from? Can I inhabit your position well? And if I'm not oriented to do that, then I'm not going to find the synthesis of a dialectic. I'm going to be arguing for one side of partiality, harming something that will actually harm the thing I care about in the long run. And then first person, can I notice my own biases and my own susceptibilities and my own group identity issues and whatever well enough that those aren't the things that run me? When I look at kind of the ancient Greek Enlightenment, the first person was the Stoic tradition. The second person was the Socratic tradition. The third person was the Aristotelian tradition. There's a mirror of all those in modernity. We need a new cultural enlightenment now that where everyone values good sense making about themselves, about others, about base reality, and good quality dialogue with other people that are also sense making to emerge to a collective consciousness and collective intelligence that is more than our individual intelligence. And so that we have some basis of something that isn't chaos, but that also isn't oppression because it's emergent more than imposed. So it's cultural enlightenment or bust as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. It's cultural enlightenment or bust. What a profound way to put it. I tend to agree that all of these modern issues are so complex that we really do need a philosophic upgrade of the populace, of everyone, so that we can all get on board with the right strategies for addressing these problems. So as he mentions, there's first person, second person, and third person epistemics that are a part of this philosophic upgrade. First person is like your I, yourself. It's your own perspective. And he relates that to, where was it? The Stoic tradition. And the second person perspective, he relates that to the Socratic tradition. So the second person, it's a dialogue between two people. And the whole tradition of Socrates, he founded the idea of the dialectic, which was they're in the conversation where you interrogate each other's perspectives, where someone claims that they have the truth, and then Socrates kind of pokes holes in their definition. If they think they know what justice is, he's like, well, what about justice in this situation? What about justice in that situation? And it's almost a kind of a cyclical attempt at debunking certain definitions, and then the interlocutor has the chance to refine their definitions. And so through this second person dialectic, we can refine our perspectives. And then the third person tradition was the Aristotelian philosophy. And so from a third person view, it's like stuff, things in the world, it's it's that over there. And Aristotle, he kind of started the tradition of physics, the sciences, where we look at objects in and of themselves and It's kind of, we separate ourselves from the object of study. And so we kind of remove our biases and we look at the thing and try to get a good understanding of what it is in and of itself. So what about these three perspectives, these three philosophic traditions helps us with the cultural enlightenment? Well, I tend to think that the first person Stoic perspective, it's an essential baseline. The Stoic tradition was all about regulating your emotions, regulating your expectations, modifying your emotional valence. And it was about asceticism, learning how to control yourself, to control your lusts and your greed. And so there was a lot of self-discipline within that first-person tradition, where if you don't have all that discipline, if your emotions and your goals are not under control, then you're not going to be able to participate effectively in the cultural debate that needs to happen, right? Everyone has had a debate with someone who is just getting emotional. You can't have a successful conversation with someone who hasn't figured out how to manage that aspect of their psyche. So once people are on board, they've regulated themselves with that Stoic perspective, then we can go to the second person perspective. Then we can engage in a dialectic with the Socratic tradition, or maybe the Hegelian tradition. Then we can actually have conversations that are oriented towards truth and refining each other's perspective. It's not about fighting, debunking, destroying. That's too rudimentary. That's too uncivilized for the Socratic tradition. Once we evolve to where we actually look at each other as partners in achieving a more enlightened perspective, then all the pettiness evaporates. And suddenly we are working together to, hey, what do you think is wrong about my perspective? Oh, what do you think about this weakness in your perspective, right? We begin to actually progress in a dialogue rather than just attack each other. And because our modern issues are so complex, we really, really need to be able to evolve past the pettiness of this debate-oriented dialogue, right? Debating is all about the win-lose. We have to evolve past that towards a win-win, because the finite game is not sustainable. We need to evolve towards the infinite game, and the infinite game gives us the win-win, and only by looking at each other as partners are we going to be able to orient our conversation towards win-win, right? And the third person perspective is the Aristotelian tradition. The key here is to remove the bias. I think that's the most essential thing. It's the attempt at objectivity. And if we can figure out how to approach these complex issues from a lens of objectivity after we subtract all the bias, that's the only way we're going to truly solve the problem in a way that benefits everyone, right? You can't have a solution to global warming that's biased. You can't have a solution to nuclear proliferation that is biased. You've got to find solutions that work for everyone, that treat everyone as equal stakeholders. So further on in the conversation, they explore the practicality of this cultural enlightenment solution. And both of them seem to agree that this is a very idealistic, multi-generational approach. And it might not happen in time to save us, right? If you want to get everyone educated, there's so many, you've got to get it implemented into the school system. And then the school system, that's a generation away for the kids to grow up to have the tools that these perspectives give them. And do we have enough time to just wait for the next generation to get educated? So I think Bret Weinstein has already explored a more immediate, quicker solution to America's cultural crisis, and that is his Unity 2020 movement. A psychology of unity is necessary to bring America back from the brink of polarization. Unity might require things like trust and common values. Every individual is going to need to reassess their relationship with the other political tribe. Isolating yourself away from the other tribe is a good way to stop understanding them. We need more cross-the-aisle interactions so that individuals will realize that the other political tribe isn't the scary monster that your media told you that they are. Only after that barrier is busted will common ground be possible to discover. But even unity, it's a very idealistic goal. Who says that anyone is going to be motivated to talking to the other political tribe? Who says that they're going to want to unify? But assuming that we are able to succeed in American unity, we will still face the Darwinian problem of international competition. How do we ensure that a Thucydides trap doesn't inevitably ensnare us in a war with China? Or how do we ensure that resource scarcity doesn't trigger a war with the Middle East? The solution seems glaringly obvious. We need a higher order degree of unity. We need order at the level of a global hegemony. Once every human on the planet feels like they are a part of the same global human tribe, then we can finally turn off our warmongering tribal psychology for good. Once everyone identifies as brothers within the same tribe, then there's no more need for warfare and conflict. But there is a huge, inconspicuously semi-dormant obstacle to this solution for world peace, which is Christianity. In my youth, I was a vigorous student of the Bible. I became obsessed with prophecies about the future. The book of Revelation produced such a phantasmagorically horrific view of the future that revolved around a tyrannical global hegemony led by the Antichrist himself, wielding all the powers of the devil to manipulate mankind into following his ways. It was stunning and so interesting that it captured my full attention. And the Bible frames this future global order as evil, or Satan-inspired, or Satan-led. And this global order necessarily requires Christian opposition, as it basically states that anyone who follows this global leader will be unable to enter heaven, but rather is destined for hell. Let me say that again. Anyone who supports a global organization, a global nation, a global hegemony, anyone who joins this globalization is unable to enter heaven, but rather destined for hell. That's a huge religious obstacle to a global order. Jordan Peterson often talks about the value of religion over ideology because religion, in his view, has more evolutionary complexity and usually produces a variety of archetypes that balance each other out. For example, the Bible may include the archetype of an evil king, but it also includes the archetype of a good king. So the followers of the Bible will not become overly biased against the concept of kings in general, right? There's a little bit of wiggle room for them to accept the idea of a good king. That's possible. Ideologies, in Jordan Peterson's view, are often less balanced. For example, in Marxism, the rich are basically evil. There is no archetype of the good rich man within Marxism. So the followers of Marxism end up killing the rich as a consequence of an unbalanced perspective. Yet within Christianity, there is no balanced concept of a good emergent global order. There is only one example of an emergent global order, and it is condemned as evil. The only offset to this archetype is the return of Christ, but that's completely unattainable because until Christ appears in the sky, dogmatic Christians will be unable to accept the idea of a good emergent global order because of the nature of their scripture. They only have an unbalanced perspective of global orders within their archetype of in the Bible. I know Christians who are legitimately worried about the imminent fulfillment of the prophecy of the Antichrist's global deep state taking over. I have observed that there is a temptation within them to want to fight back violently against the deep state because they truly believe that there is a evil lurking and coming to get them. The extreme nature of the biblical narrative produces the desire for and the justification for violence as a response. I mean, if this global order truly is satanic, and if they're out to get you, and if they want to control you and suppress your religious freedoms and torment you and oppress you, if this is their true goals, then as God's servants, your duty is to resist this evil. The evil is aiming to destroy God's church. And so when it comes to the evolutionary perspective of religion, we haven't had global orders in enough frequency for our narratives, for our mythology to know how to deal with them, right? If every 1,000 years there's a global order, then maybe the Bible would have a couple examples of good and bad global orders. But they don't. They've just got evil empires and evil global orders. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we haven't had enough time for religion to evolve a good mythology for global orders, right? So there's not enough evolutionary time to give us the evolutionary wisdom. So you can't rely on religion to solve this problem. And so the only way the religious would have to appeal to the veracity of their religion, right? But those on the outside of Christianity, it's just foolishness to us, but it's real to them. And so we have to take it seriously because they are a stakeholder that we need to work with in achieving these ends. So within this Antichrist prophecy of an evil global order, this evil global order is symbolized by a dragon, or at least the dragon gives power to this global hegemony. And so it may be very easy for Christians to fear this symbolic dragon. But as Jordan Peterson says, the path of the hero is to voluntarily face your fears, confront the dragon, and in doing so, you obtain the gold. That which you both desire and need is behind this dragon. So when it comes to facing the dragon, that doesn't necessarily mean using violence against him. Perhaps what it really means is understanding the dragon. Only through truly understanding the dragon will you realize that the power of the dragon, while being worthy of your fear, that power is exactly what you need. A global hegemony is a scary idea. It has been dramatized in many stories as the archetype of an evil empire. We should be cautious about creating any global order that contains power, because power can be misused. But if power is used correctly, it can make the world a better place. And with all the complexity of the global issues that we have, we need global power to offset global problems. So Daniel also begins to go into how civilization might collapse if we don't figure out this cultural enlightenment.
And we see that civilizations fail towards either oppression or chaos, right? Those are the two fail states. They fail towards oppression if trying to create some coherence happens through a top-down forcing function. They fail towards chaos if not having enough top-down forcing function, everybody kind of believes whatever they want, but they have no unifying basis for belief. And so then they will end up going into, they'll balkanize, they'll tribalize, and then the tribal groups will fight against each other. If you don't want to, so either we keep failing towards chaos, which we can see is happening in the West and in the US in particular right now. And then China, which is happy to do the oppression thing, and oppression beats chaos in war, right? Because it has more ability to execute effectively, which is why China has built high-speed trains all around the world when we haven't built a single one in our country. So either we lose to China in the 21st century and oppression runs the 21st century, or we beat China at being China, meaning beat it at oppression, or it's like, fuck, those are both failure modes. What is there other than oppression or chaos is order that is emergent, not imposed, which requires a culture of people who can all make sense of the world on their own and communicate effectively to have shared sense making as a basis for shared choice making. The idea of an open society is that some huge number of people can all make choices together, a huge number of people who see the world differently and are anonymous to each other, not a tribe. That was an Enlightenment era idea, right? Born out of the idea that we could all make sense of the world together, born out of the philosophy of science and the Hegelian dialectic, that we could make sense of base reality and that we could make sense of each other's perspective, dialectic, find a synthesis, and then be able to have that be the basis of governance. So what I think is this is not an adequate long-term structure, because we can talk about why tech has made nation-state democracies obsolete, and it's just not obvious yet, but it has. But as an intermediate structure, the reboot of the thing that was intended has to start at the level of the people, at culture, and at collective sense-making and collective good faith dialogue, because without that, you can't bind state. Without that, you can't bind market incentive.
All right, so Daniel makes a couple good points here. He says that civilizations either fail towards oppression or they fail towards chaos. They either fail towards too much control, too much tyranny, and the people are oppressed and they're unhappy and they revolt and they topple the government, right? That's one way nations fail. They also fail towards chaos when the government is too weak and there's too much decentralization and there's too much corruption spread out through the system. And there's too many self-interested parties competing and vying for resources, and too much anarchy and too much infighting. And so all of this internecine conflict just fractures and dissolves the state into nothingness, and to where they get conquered by their neighbor because they're too disorganized. I notice that in America, the right and the libertarians, they often want to complain that the American government is a tyranny, that there's too much control. But if you compare America to China, we are way closer to anarchy, we are way closer to freedom, and we're way closer to dissolving into chaos than to being controlled and oppressed. The contrast is pretty stark. In America, our freedom of speech, it gives us the freedom to be extremely divided. It's the freedom to vilify and demonize each other, the freedom to slander our government and slander political officials, right? Our freedom of speech is the freedom for us to hate each other, and the freedom for us to organize against each other, and our freedom to self-destruct into civil war. That's what we have in America. We have a system that is much closer to chaos. And so that's why Daniel, he thinks that we are on the path to collapsing into chaos. And China might be the nation that survives. If they might be the superpower that transcends as America, our game theoretic strategy, right? Each political system is like its own game theory. And America has the Constitution, which is our game theory, is we believe that free speech will be a good strategy for our society. But America has already collapsed into civil war once. And so it might turn out that free speech is actually a bad strategy for humans. We're not smart enough, we're not responsible enough, we're not wise enough, we're not moral and virtuous enough to handle the power of free speech. That's one possible reality. And if it is the case that we are not virtuous enough to handle free speech, maybe we will self-destruct because we have too much freedoms. And maybe China will succeed because oppression and discipline and control and forced unity, maybe that's a better strategy evolutionarily. Evolution doesn't care about our morality. Evolution just cares about what succeeds. And so maybe China's strategy offends American sensibilities, but evolution doesn't care about American moral sensibilities. And so maybe our strategy is going to collapse, but maybe China's strategy will collapse too. And so if we're trying to make the world a better place, if we're trying to survive through all these potential catastrophes on the horizon, we need to figure out what's a sustainable strategy. What type of system matches human nature enough to where we can fix our own flaws, overcome our own flaws, mitigate our own flaws, and maximize well-being into the future, right? We've got to figure out how to toe the line. How do we balance too much freedom, too much control? Like, there's pros and cons to both. We've got to find the right balance. But when demonization is the name of the game, there's no balance. Balance becomes blasphemy when your principle becomes a dogmatic religious virtue. If freedom is sacred, then implementing vaccine measures, control becomes a sin. It becomes evil. We can't function successfully as a society when we're not allowed to balance things. That is a path to destruction. And so that's why Daniel is very astutely outlining this framework, how we need this philosophic upgrade, because the philosophic upgrade, it gives us the ability to unite and to synthesize and to not demonize, to not dogmatically, either this or that, it's only my way or the highway. That type of biased thinking, it's not going to work. It's too self-destructive. We have to have balance. We have to have an unbiased approach. We have to weigh pros and cons. We have to bring all the factors to the table in order to mitigate all the problems and create the best strategy going forward. And so we have to get this philosophic upgrade in the population, because the population, that is where the self-destruction is going to happen. So if we can help get the population to be unbiased, to be balanced, to be inclusive of ideas and ideologies and value systems, that's the only way we're going to get out of this. And so once we have the philosophic upgrade, once we have a proper collective dialogue, then we can assess the pros and cons of a higher order of unity, of a worldwide government, and we can logically discuss the dangers of centralization and the dangers of decentralization, and we can bring all of the important factors and stakeholders to the table, and we can do system design, and we can actually be productive because we're not dogmatically afraid. It's like, oh, this is evil no matter what. It's like, oh, if we get a good design, then it's not evil, because the way we have a balance of powers and checks and balances, we're mitigating the dangers that you're afraid of. We're fixing that with the way we design it. So we need to be able to have that mature dialogue to get to that mature place where we can implement a mature solution. But if our population is mired in the dogmatic bias and the religious fears that no matter what, a worldwide system is always going to be evil, no matter how carefully it's designed, then we will fail to achieve those higher order levels of cooperation. We will fail to solve things at the global level, and we might pay for that in self-destruction. And if we fail to do this, if we fail to act, perhaps China will fill in the void for our failures. China will not be religiously afraid of creating a global order, and after we self-destruct, perhaps China will rise to the occasion, and they will create the global order and the global unity that we failed to do. And they will implement their values into the global system, and maybe China will create a global tyranny that won't be designed with our values, that won't be designed with as many good checks and balances as might be needed, and perhaps China will create that dragon, that evil empire that the Christians were afraid of in the first place. Perhaps the Christian fear of a worldwide government will be their own undoing and will cause the creation of such thing. So I don't think we can afford inaction because we need a good worldwide order. All right, to review what we've discussed. Number one, exponential tech is self-destructive. Nations compete on world-destroying black projects. And this technology, it feeds down to smaller and smaller groups until one group is willing to use these world-destroying technologies. And mutually assured destruction game theory, it only works on these larger organizations because those larger organizations have the self-interest to maintain themselves. But when you allow these technologies to filter down to smaller and smaller groups, the probability that a small group is willing to self-destruct gets larger and larger the smaller the group is. Because the number of crazy people that have to work together it's easier to pull off. If you want to get a nation to self-destruct, you've got to get a lot of crazy people in power to get them to all agree on self-destruction. But in a smaller and smaller group, getting a lot of crazy people in positions of power is easier and easier. So the next point is we evolved to solve competition with cooperation. So just like tribes, we solved the problem of competing tribes with uniting into a cooperative nation. Now we have competing nations, and the only way we can solve competing nations is to unite them into a larger global order. The next point, exponential population growth is self-destructive. Finite resources can't handle exponential growth. Gambling on technological growth isn't wise or sustainable, given that technological growth can also be self-destructive. And then the resulting scarcity invites war. And then we solve the problem of war by uniting into larger tribes, hearkening back to the solution, overcoming competition with cooperation. And then there's the issue with Darwinism. Evolutionarily, every species relies on Darwinism to weed out problematic strategies, to weed out problematic behaviors, to weed out problematic technologies and problematic political opinions. But we can't rely on Darwinism anymore because at our current level of power, our current level of technology and influence, our errors are no longer local errors. Our errors are now existential threats that apply to the entire planet. If we make a Darwinian error now, it could be the end of the game for everyone. There's no evolutionary recovery from a planet-wide catastrophe. And so we have to be proactive and self-evolve to fix our problems. We can't rely on, Darwinism to fix it for us. And lastly, the solution to the oppression chaos trap is the collective philosophic upgrade of the people. Only when everyone is on board with balanced philosophic thinking can we all cooperate together in a way that our cooperation grows into larger and larger orders of cooperation. And that cooperation gives us the collective intelligence to self-evolve and correct these problems before they occur. So if you are one of the Christians who's been listening up until now, I really want to applaud you. I want to thank you for being open-minded and considering other points of view. We need people like you. Some Christians, they're never going to listen to a contrary perspective because they're kind of stuck in their ways. But we need open-minded Christians like you to listen to the other side and then try to communicate back to the other Christians, hey, there's another perspective, right? Maybe we should be less dogmatic about this one world order type stuff because X, Y, and Z. We really need people like you to be intermediaries because we have to work together as a population. If we don't want to just fight each other, we need to communicate, talk to, persuade. And so I appreciate you for listening thus far. But my guess is that many of you are probably not fully persuaded. And so the rest of my time here, I want to devote to digging deeper into the prophecy in the Bible, specifically the book of Revelation, and to kind of make an argument for why we shouldn't be so dogmatic about that prophecy. And so hopefully, if you haven't been persuaded thus far, the next arguments will bring you a little bit closer to my side. I appreciate you for listening thus far. And, if you enjoyed this discussion, if you appreciated the context, please give me a like and maybe a subscribe. These types of things take a lot of work, a lot of filming, a lot of thought, and a lot of care. And so I hope you know, every little like and subscribe, it just, you know, gives me a little bit of boost, a little bit more motivation to keep going and making more videos, and it helps spread the word. So appreciate it very much.